So now we've talked a little about the Facebook platform and its support for developers. Let's start to look at some specifics of how we work with Facebook data and the fundamental means of accessing Facebook data, the Graph API. So why Graph API? At the very core of Facebook itself is the social graph. The social graph can be visualized as a web which plots the relationships between people and their connections to each other and the connections to objects within the graph, such as photos, albums, videos, posts, etc. Every object within the social graph has a unique ID, and we can use the Facebook Graph API to retrieve information about objects within the social graph. The Facebook Graph API is truly the key to the social graph. Through it, we are provided with HTTP or HTTPS URL access to any object within the graph. All data available for that object is returned as a JSON object, and the objects within the graph, which we can query through the Facebook Graph API, are, for example, users, pages, events, groups, applications, status messages, photos, photo albums, profile pictures, videos, notes, and check-ins. Objects within the graph can be referenced by ID, or in the case of some objects, such as people, they can be referenced by name. If we take a look at one example, and that is the profile information for Mark Zuckerberg, we can actually look at his information by name, using his username, and what we see is the publicly available information returned from his Facebook profile. If we look at the structure of the data returned, we'll see his ID, his name, a URL link to his profile picture, the link to his profile. We'll also see that 4,744,557 people have liked his page, and we'll see various information that he's made publicly available. Other objects within the social graph, for example Facebook groups, can be retrieved by ID, and there the structure of the data returned is slightly different. In this case, with groups, we have a group owner returned as an object within the JSON data. And were we to, for example, retrieve data for Facebook wall posts or feeds, we'd actually have a number of entries and most probably have too many entries to actually retrieve all at once. In this case, we'd see at the end of the object returned some paging information with links for previous and next sets of return data. We can use this information to build navigation links or buttons, and when we look at the limit equals 25 parameter within these URL links that are returned for us, it may seem logical to use limit to limit the number of data rows returned. It is, however, safer to use the since and until parameters to build links, as we'll see in a moment. If we use limit as a means of limiting the amount of data returned by a Graph API query, we may find that due to Facebook privacy restrictions and the data actually visible to the end viewer of our application, that some of the information is removed. So as you'll see in this graphic here, specifying limit equals 10 may actually return only 7 results. The cumulative effect of using this to control paging may be that results are skipped or missed, or that the user becomes confused by the paging we've adopted. Restricting results range by date using since and until will avoid this situation. We can use since and until as restrictions for retrieval of check-ins, feed, home, links, notes, photos, posts, statuses, tagged, and videos via the Graph API. So the social graph comprises people, objects, relationships between them. We can retrieve data using the Facebook Graph API. We can limit the data we retrieve to allow us to page through data such as wall posts or check-ins. How would we go about actually getting information about a user in our Facebook applications? To retrieve information about the user who's logged in to our application, we can use the Graph API me call. Me will always return the information for the logged in user. What you may find, should you just simply code graph.facebook.com/me, is that you'll receive an OAuth exception error message. The simple reason for this is that all applications must go through a process of authorization to ensure that 1. The user accepts the application and agrees to use it, and 2. Grants the application access to any data that it requires. This ensures that applications cannot access any information which the user wishes to keep private. Authorization allows you to then retrieve information on behalf of a user, having been authorized by that user to do so. It requires that you request permission to access data your application requires, and is supported via OAuth 2. The authorization process will result in the granting of an access token, which is then used to make Graph API calls from within the application. We'll be covering the process of authorization and how to go about requesting permissions, etc. at a later point. Let's first take a look at the Graph API Explorer, which is a tool provided by Facebook that allows you to make Graph API calls and to see the sort of results you'll get. The Graph API Explorer can be reached through the Facebook developers website or directly via URL. The URL you'll use to reach the Graph API Explorer is developers.facebook.com Tools Explorer. And the first thing you'll notice when you go into the Explorer is that it will pick up your Facebook user ID, assuming you're logged into Facebook at the time, and then retrieve the publicly available information from your profile. The data shown is in the structure of a JSON object. If you look down on the right-hand side, you'll see a list of the fields returned and their meaning. You may find, or most probably will find, that not all of this information will be shown by default, for the simple reason that you won't have a completely open profile. Clicking on Albums, for example, will then find the Albums connection for your profile and will show a list of albums that you own. You'll see from looking at the URL that to retrieve albums for a specific user, you simply append albums onto the end of the URL and you will get data for that connection. For other connections, you will simply click onto the type of information required here and you will see it in the return data. With Back to Parent, we can go to the parent node, in this case, my normal profile information. And by clicking Get Access Token, we can emulate the behavior of requesting more permissions from within our application, and Facebook will prompt us with the dialog which we're so used to seeing from applications when they load. In this case, I'm going to grant the Graph API further rights to see my information. So by clicking, for example, User Location and User Hometown, I'm now granting the Graph API the same rights that I would be granting an application should I agree to let it access this data. I see the user request for permission. I can click Allow, and now we should see further information returned just by making the same call. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time clicking around in my profile information here for you today, but I certainly suggest you take a look at the Graph API Explorer. Click around on the various connections available, grant extended permissions, and then take a look at the data that's returned, and that will give you an idea of the sort of data you'll be able to retrieve through the Graph API and how you'll be able to then use that data within your applications.